shadows of history.
In 1979, at the height of Cold War tension, the Arctic Ocean became one of the most heavily monitored yet least understood regions on Earth. Soviet research vessels frequently operated in these waters, often under the label of scientific exploration. But on one particular night, according to fragmented accounts and unofficial reports, something unusual occurred aboard a vessel known as the Vityaz. A signal, unidentified, irregular, and never fully explained, was reportedly detected deep beneath the ice. The transmission lasted only seconds, but it triggered confusion among the crew. Equipment malfunctioned, readings became unstable, and then silence. No official distress call was recorded, no emergency response was ever documented. Yet traces of that moment seem to exist, buried in inconsistencies, erased logs, and stories that were never meant to leave the ship. What happened that night remains unclear, but whatever it was, it didn't fit the narrative that was later presented to the world. Officially, the Vityaz was a symbol of scientific advancement. Operated by Soviet oceanographic institutions, it conducted hundreds of research missions across the globe. Its purpose was simple on paper: explore the ocean, collect data, and expand human knowledge. But during the Cold War, science was rarely just science. Oceanographic vessels played a dual role, mapping underwater terrain not only for research, but for military advantage. Submarine routes, acoustic conditions, and deep-sea anomalies were all strategically valuable, and vessels like the Vityaz were perfectly positioned to gather that data under the cover of academic research. While official records highlight peaceful missions, they do not always tell the full story. Certain routes remain undocumented, some expeditions lack detailed reports, and in a system built on secrecy, absence of evidence does not necessarily mean absence of events. It raises a different question entirely: what was never meant to be recorded? When researchers began examining Soviet maritime archives decades later, they noticed something unusual. The records of the Vityaz, while extensive, were not complete. Certain time periods, particularly around the late 1970s, contained gaps, missing pages, incomplete logs, references to missions without corresponding reports. At first glance, this might seem insignificant. Archival data, especially from that era, is often imperfect, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Entire segments of operational history appeared fragmented, as if deliberately edited. Even more concerning were references to coordinates that were never officially acknowledged, locations in the Arctic that did not match known scientific routes. It's not uncommon for classified missions to leave minimal traces, but when multiple inconsistencies align around the same time frame, it suggests something more deliberate, not an accident, not oversight, but removal. The kind of removal that raises a dangerous possibility that something did happen, and someone made sure it would never be fully known. To understand the possibility of a hidden incident, you have to understand the system that surrounded it. The Cold War was not just fought on land or in the skies, it extended deep into the oceans. Both the Soviet Union and NATO relied heavily on underwater intelligence. Oceanographic data became a strategic asset, and research vessels were often the perfect cover. Declassified documents from Western intelligence agencies reveal a consistent pattern: civilian ships conducting operations with military implications, mapping ocean floors, testing acoustic signals, monitoring submarine activity. If the Vityaz was involved in such operations, it would not be unusual. What would be unusual is transparency, because operations tied to national security were rarely disclosed, even decades later. The deeper question is not whether secrecy existed. It absolutely did. The question is whether one of those classified missions went wrong, and if it did, what would have been done to keep it hidden? The reported signal remains the most mysterious element of this story. According to unofficial accounts, it did not resemble typical sonar returns. It was irregular, unstable, almost as if it was moving unpredictably beneath the vessel. Some descriptions suggest it originated from extreme depth, far beyond standard research zones.
Others claim it interfered with onboard instruments, causing temporary malfunctions. Without official records, these details remain impossible to verify. But what makes the story compelling isn't the signal itself, it's the reaction to it. Because if it was insignificant, it would have been logged and forgotten. Instead, what followed appears to have been silence, no report, no explanation, just absence. And in historical investigation, absence can sometimes be more revealing than presence.
In any normal maritime incident, especially involving a state-operated vessel, there would be a response. Reports would be filed, communications would be logged, emergency protocols would be activated. But in the case surrounding the alleged 1979 Arctic mission, something stands out. Not what was recorded, but what wasn't. There is no publicly available evidence of an official Soviet response to any unusual event involving the Vityaz during that period. No investigation report, no acknowledgement, nothing. And during the Cold War, silence was rarely accidental. It was often deliberate. Soviet naval command structures were highly centralized, and any anomaly, especially in sensitive regions like the Arctic, would have been escalated immediately. The absence of documentation suggests one of two possibilities. Either nothing happened at all, or something happened that was classified at the highest level. Because in a system built on control, information wasn't just withheld, it was managed, filtered, and when necessary, completely erased from accessible history. Decades after the Cold War began to fade, fragments of personal accounts started to surface, stories told quietly, often without documentation, and sometimes without names. A few individuals believed to have had indirect connections to Soviet maritime operations described an incident involving unusual readings and a sudden shift in protocol during an Arctic mission in the late 1970s. These accounts remain unverified. There are no official records that confirm them. But what makes them interesting is their consistency. Different voices, separated by time and context, describe similar details: confusion among crew members, restricted communication, and a rapid return order that was never publicly explained. One former sailor, speaking anonymously years later, suggested that whatever was encountered was not considered routine, but without evidence, such statements remain anecdotal. And that raises a critical question. Are these just stories, shaped by memory and speculation, or are they fragments of something that was never meant to be fully revealed? In historical investigation, even unreliable accounts can point toward patterns, if those patterns repeat often enough. One of the more subtle inconsistencies appears not in deep-sea records, but in something far more ordinary: port arrival logs. Maritime operations rely heavily on scheduling. Every vessel departure and arrival is typically documented with precision, but in certain archival fragments tied to Arctic ports, there are irregularities, dates that don't align, entries that appear to have been modified. In some cases, references to expected arrivals that were quietly removed or replaced. Now, it's important to be cautious here. Archival errors are not uncommon, especially in older records. But when those discrepancies align with already fragmented mission logs, they become harder to dismiss. If a vessel deviated from its schedule, there should be a reason: weather conditions, mechanical issues, emergency protocols. Yet no such explanations appear in accessible records. This doesn't prove that something extraordinary happened, but it does highlight a gap between what should have been recorded and what actually exists. And sometimes that gap is where the real story begins. Today, the Vityaz is remembered very differently. It exists as a preserved museum ship, a symbol of scientific achievement and maritime exploration. Visitors walk its decks, read its history, and see it as a completed chapter of the past. And according to official records, that's exactly what it is: a successful vessel, a documented legacy, a closed story. But history is rarely that simple, because what we accept as official is often the result of what was allowed to be recorded, not necessarily everything that happened.
The possibility of an undocumented incident does not automatically rewrite history, but it challenges how we interpret it. It forces us to ask whether the absence of evidence is truly proof of nothing, or simply the result of controlled information. The Vityaz may never be more than what the records say it is, but the inconsistencies, the gaps, and the unanswered questions suggest that there may be always another layer, one that exists not in official archives, but in the shadows just beyond them. History is often presented as a complete record, a timeline of events carefully documented and preserved. But the reality is far more complex, especially during the Cold War, where information was controlled, edited, and sometimes erased entirely. The story of the Vityaz may never be fully confirmed. It may remain nothing more than a collection of inconsistencies, rumors, and unanswered questions, but that doesn't make it meaningless, because sometimes the most important stories are not the ones we can prove, but the ones we are not allowed to fully investigate. So the question remains, did nothing happen at all, or did something happen that was never meant to survive history? If you want to explore the stories hidden beneath official narratives, subscribe to Shadows of History, where we don't just tell history, we question it.